Before the break, gentlemen, we have been discussing Exhibit 951, and we had been examining Slide 7. Before I leave Slide 7 for another slide, I want to get your comments on. I note that the last bullet on that slide references guidance papers and analysis partial list, and there's a few of them there. The Sandy Fraser papers, which we've now marked as exhibits on planning units and interim guidance for integrated plans, they're part of the guidance papers that informs the discussion at DFO with respect to Strategy 4. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then Julie Gardner's report on the DFO workshop, which we've also very recently marked as an exhibit, is there, and that helps inform the discussion on Strategy 4. Is that right?
That was the intent, yes.
Right. And then Julie Gardner's work that she did while she was with Dovetail for Watershed Watch Suzuki Foundation. Are you familiar with that report, Mr. Ryle?
Not really.
All right. Mr. Saunders, are you familiar with that report?
I've read the report, but not recently.
Okay.
Yes.
But maybe just to see if I can refresh your memory, Exhibit 244, I think, is it 244 or 224? I can't recall now. I'm becoming dyslexic in my waning years, Mr. Commissioner. You have to forgive me. There it is. Thank you, Mr. Lunn. I knew I could count on him. And is it 244?
224.
224, thank you. Is this the report, Knowledge Integration and Salmon Conservation and Sustainability Planning, that you read a long time ago, Mr. Saunders?
That's correct, yes.
Right. Mr. Young, this report was commissioned by Watershed Watch along with David Suzuki Foundation. Once again, why was a report like this commissioned?
Given our perspective of the importance of Strategy 4 to the implementation of the policy, we commissioned this report to try to facilitate that implementation.
Okay, and then going back now to Slide 7, the Mark Nellitz paper for the Suzuki Foundation in March 2009. Are either of you gentlemen from DFO familiar with that work?
Yes, I've read the report.
Right. And just for reference, I think it's Exhibit 937, Mr. Lunn, if I could just pull it up briefly just to make sure. It's entitled Returning Salmon, Integrated Planning, and the Wild Salmon Policy in BC. Have you read that report, Mr. Saunders?
Yes.
And does that provide some guidance and analysis with respect to Strategy 4 that is of some benefit to DFO?
Yes, I would say it is, yes.
Could we now have tab 8, please?
Commissioner.
Oh, sorry, slide 8.
Sorry.
Not used to sitting on Fridays, Mr. Commissioner. It's usually my informal day. I found this graph to be quite interesting because diagrammatically it attempts to place WSP planning units on a scale of how it's going to fit in. And if I interpret the graph correctly, well, let me ask you first, Mr. Ryle, you're familiar with this depiction?
Yes, I am.
All right. So if I have it right, at the bottom of this pyramid, you start with individuals CUs, some 400 in number, because we're talking about all of the salmon within BC. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then from there, as you move up, you encounter something called management units. What are management units? How are they fitting into the scheme? Are they the aggregate runs, or the management units, or the stock timing groups? I'm not sure what management units are.
Well, it's discussed in the wild salmon policy as well that one would put together management units. Using Fraser River Sockeye as the example, we have 4 management units, early Stewart, early Summers, Summers, and Lates. So they're going to be a combination of conservation units. And the graph that we showed earlier shows the linkage between management units and conservation units.
And so moving then up, we've got wild salmon policy planning units. And are they meant to take into consideration the CUs somehow? Is that how they're supposed to work?
Yes, they would be taken into account CUs. I think we've heard testimony from all of the panel members here about the challenges of how to and what scale to undertake these strategic plans. And it's our view that within DFO is that we're not going to develop those strategic plans on a scale of CUs, but we'll be take those into account broader. There's a lot of biological reasons for doing that, and also where these fish are harvested. And as I talked about earlier, it's my view that the FRISI process does represent a wild salmon policy implementation. And why do I say that? Is it perfect? No, that's not my testimony. It's not a perfect, and it doesn't encompass everything. It did not, I would agree with Mr. Young and Mr. Morley that it doesn't include the habitat and ecosystem parts, but it includes a very important part of wild salmon policy, which is specifying biological targets for conservation units and groups of conservation units to ensure conservation and sustainable use. So the issue around developing FRISI to me is a portion of implementation of WSP, and one not going to wait till you have all the answers. You need to act and put those pieces together, and to me it's a really fundamental piece of wild salmon policy implementation. And I think as well, this concept of response teams, I don't personally think that there's one answer that fits all in response teams. And I note in the actual wild salmon policy document that response teams is in quotations, meaning that there is some lack of prescription around what a response team is. And I think that's one of the things that we have struggled with. What is a response team going to look like? Are you going to have a body sitting, working on one conservation unit? Are you going to bring these people together at particular times? And I think that's why we need to carefully consider what a response team is and what its tasks are going to be undertaken. And the work that Sandy did underlined a template, and it's not meant to be prescriptive either. It's meant to be a guide of how one would develop a integrated strategic plan.
And right at the pinnacle of this pyramid, you have the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan. I just want to turn to you, Mr. Morley and Mr. Young. Do you have any comments on this schematic depiction of how conservation units and wild salmon policy planning units are depicted here? Maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Young.
If possible, I'd like to comment on both, in particular the definition of a management unit as well as the term prescription that Paul Ryle used. I'll start with management units. The first is that my interpretation of the policy is that a management unit could be an appropriate unit for management in so much as it adequately represents the component CUs. In particular, that decisions made around a management unit ensure that the component CUs are adequately protected. For example, if there's a CU in the red zone that exploitation rate is assigned to a management unit, that it's consistent with maintaining that exploitation rate for recovery at the CU level. With respect to FRISI and the management of the Fraser sockeye fisheries, I do not see the 4 timing aggregates as consistent with that definition of a management unit for a number of reasons. One is that it is not reflective of the component CUs. 2, assignment of the stocks that are used in that I think is problematic. I think it's fairly loosely associated with timing. I think there's some stocks that are kind of misassigned within that, and that as a result, exploitation rates targeting on one management unit do not result in a consistent impact on component CUs or the stocks used there. So that's one problem. With respect to prescription, if it's okay if we go to Appendix 2 of the wild salmon policy.
That's Exhibit 8.
I'll agree with Mr. Ryle that the response team element is relatively unprescriptive, but what is prescriptive within the policy is essentially what, as a baseline, needs to be done with respect to CUs, and that's particularly CUs in the red zone. So in that very beginning of Step 1, I think it clearly identifies some of the elemental steps of WSP implementation, and that we need to start with an understanding of CUs exploited in the fishery, what their status is, habitat and ecosystem constraints for each of these CUs, and then in particular for CUs in the red zone, more detailed reports will also be provided as become available. They'll incorporate ATK, And then if we go, I don't think it's necessary to go there, but if we go into strategy 4 within the WSP as well, it provides that prescription about the need to develop recovery plans for CUs in the red zone. So this is the place I think we need to get to around fisheries as well as habitat and ecosystem management, and that we're clearly not there yet.
Mr. Morley, did you want to add anything?
I would like to add that just the schematic you had up previously with the pyramid there, and it sort of expands a little bit on what Jeffrey is saying here, is that the whole way this is directed, sort of heading up to an IFMP, is really tends to result on, and the terminology of management units really is focusing on the whole area of harvest management as opposed to a holistic view of the world. And I think just taking the example of my involvement in the Cultus Lake Recovery Team and as an example of dealing with a CU that clearly is going to be in the red zone, is that the evidence from that experience was that, well, over-harvesting may have been a contributing factor to the decline of Cultus, that certainly all the evidence, when we looked at in detail and the threats it's currently facing and the issues that need to be addressed if you're actually going to rebuild that, are that the harvest management was the least of the issues that was a problem going forward, given the rate we've cut back harvests in recent years, and that unless the holistic view was taken to deal with the issues of freshwater productivity and survival, looking at what was happening to these fish en route and early entry, and looking at ocean survival, that in fact it did not matter what you did in harvest management, whether you harvested at 0% or at 50 or 60%, that you could never possibly hope to rebuild Cultus sockeye. And using that example and saying that we're now developing a planning process that's still really focused on how we're harvesting these fish and doesn't incorporate a number of the other areas, I think is a major problem moving forward. I do agree, though, that the idea that we're going to develop comprehensive strategic plans for 400 CUs is not going to happen, and that we do need to find some way to aggregate these. And I do believe that looking at something that is more focused on watershed or broader areas as developing a long-term strategic plan is the right approach to go. But we certainly still need to deal with what the implications are for individual CUs in the red zone, and what the options are in dealing with them, and where we're going on those in a more holistic way.
Thank you. If I can now look at slide 12, you should have a slide that shows gaps, challenges, and opportunities. And under the heading, I find resources, human and financial. So obviously, you need bodies and you need money in order to make this function. And so this is now being identified as a significant gap or a challenge. Is that right, Mr. Ryle?
Yes, that's right.
And then the second one, I think, is also fairly instructive. Clarity regarding DFO's role, objectives, and governance. And there's a couple of subheadings there. The role in leading or supporting planning initiatives is not always clear. Internal coordination is lacking in some cases. Lack of clear governance structure for implementation of Strategy 4, and lack of a strategic plan or operational guidance for Strategy 4. So those are essentially, you would agree with those comments, would you not, Mr. Ryle?
I would agree with those comments as written, yes.
The lack of a clear or consistent governance structure for integrated planning process, we talked a bit about that. The need for an approach for integrating strategic plans into the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan, that needs to be done. Is that correct, Mr. Ryle?
Yes, and we've heard previous questions, testimony today and yesterday about how we're planning on moving ahead on some of these things. But I think, just a recent conversation we had about the complexity of what sort of scale is one going to develop these around some of those challenges.
Some of the opportunities are an increased role for First Nations and others via co-management initiatives. Is that moving forward to your knowledge?
Yes, it is.
And then there's a reference to the province of BC, Living Rivers funding and capacity, and the changes to the Water Act. You're familiar with the so-called modernization of the Water Act, the Provincial Water Act, are you?
Yes, I am.
And so there's a challenge and an opportunity at the same time with respect to liaison with the province with respect to this modernization of the Water Act. Is that fair to say?
I think there's an opportunity there, and I think that we need to take advantage of that and work with the province.
And so then if I look at the next slide, proposed approach, number 13, there are some solutions being proposed, and you read through these. I'm not going to go through them in the interest of time, but you would agree with these approaches in order to address some of the challenges and gaps that we've just reviewed?
I would. The intent of this presentation was to provide the previous slide that we talked about, the gaps and the challenges, and get some discussion and direction from the committee on the proposed approach.
And then under the next slide, number 14, potential next steps. And these are defined in aspects of time, and there's actually some discrete time intervals here. So in the short term, May through December 2011, FAM, that's the Fisheries Aquaculture Management, is that what that acronym stands for?
That's correct.
I'm getting better at this.
Yeah.
I used to see these acronyms and sort of panic, but I guess I'm becoming too inured to DFO
Well, not to upset you.
language.
Not to upset you, but we changed the name on FAM.
Please don't do that, Mr. Ryle. We lawyers don't like it when you start changing names on
We
us.
just took an A out, that's all.
The short term says FAM and science to undertake a rapid assessment to determine priority CU. So the expectation is that within the next 6 months, there's going to be and I was going to be glib and ask you what rapid was in the context of DFO, but I'm not going to go there with you. But undertake rapid assessment to determine priority CUs. So essentially, this priority CUs, there's something that's going to unfold in the next 6 months about that determination. And are you aware in your roles, either you, Mr. Saunders, or Mr. Ryle, how that's going to unfold?
Well, I'm certainly aware of the rapid assessment approach, so that's a key part of my responsibility.
Right. And so is that part of that approach is to make sure that the Sue Grant paper, which looked at benchmarks for some of the conservation units and which ones specifically with respect to Fraser River sockeye I'm speaking, and specifically with what conservation units are in the red zone, is that what is meant here by this assessment to determine priority CUs?
We're certainly undertaking the development of that rapid assessment technique. It's not meant to be absolutely definitive. It's more to guide planning going forward. So I wouldn't. It's not the final word on status, but it's certainly intended to inform prioritization and work going forward, planning for priority CUs. I can't say that I've fully am engaged in understanding how we're going to move forward on identification of those priority CUs, because as I've said before, it's more than just the conservation priority that needs to be included in that.
Right. And a couple of the other bullets I just want to highlight very quickly. The third one down, the last one under short term, it says develop an approach for inclusion of socioeconomic information's NHQ paper. I take that to be national headquarters. Is that right, Mr. Ryle?
That's correct.
Is there such a paper? Have we already seen that?
No, I don't believe we have.
So the Gislason paper and some of the other material that your council submitted into evidence, that's not what is meant by socioeconomic information in the context of WSP.
No, those were papers that I contracted here within the Pacific region.
All right. Can we now move to tab 16 of the commission documents, please? The heading on this is Strategic Directions Committee discussion paper. Have either of you seen this at the time that it was being prepared? If you go to the second page, it might help you with respect to the date. and the author. The author appears to be Corey Jackson, approved by Rebecca Reed. The date is April 14th, 2011, and the date submitted to the Strategic Directions Committee was April 7, 2011. Did either of you have a hand in drafting this or vetting this paper before it went to the STC?
I don't recall this. I mean, this is paper here that Corey put together is linked to the presentation that we just went through.
Yes.
I don't recall whether I commented on this or not.
Okay. Mr. Saunders, do you recall seeing this at all?
I don't recall, but that doesn't mean I didn't. I'm not familiar with it though.
Okay. I take it that you see a lot of documents and a lot of papers cross your desk on a fairly regular basis. So are you guys suffering from too many papers, too many memos, too many emails?
It's one of my challenges.
We're in the same boat there, Mr. Ryle. Let me go back, because I understood that this paper was basically prepared leading up to the STC meeting of April 14th, 2011. Do I have that right?
I believe you do. It was to be a piece that would go with it. But I don't recall the actual content in here, so can't really help you on that.
And I want to just focus in the brief time I have remaining to the next steps. We saw some of the next steps, and I'm at page 2 of the document, Mr. Lunn, at the very end. We're right there. And I want to talk about over the longer term, January 2012 and beyond, work would include initiating interim planning processes for high priority CUs. And then it says developing a draft framework for a long-term integrated planning process. And I just want to see if I can understand what is meant by the department when it refers to long-term integrated planning process. Can you provide some information to me, Mr. Ryle or Mr. Saunders, about what the department means when it says the long-term integrated planning process?
Well, what I see in this is, I guess, really two pieces. One is, and hence the process piece of this, is what is the governance and how you're going to undertake these, and the other is, as we talked about quite a bit today, is around what the scale of, so you need to determine the scale before you can really determine the process.
Yes.
And my experience has been that you're not going to find one exact solution around the Pacific region, and there's different interest in different parts of the region and who would participate. I've participated and attended meetings with representatives of the Fraser Basin municipal level, and in some of those areas they're very much interested in participating, and others not so much. And so that's what I think this bullet's referring to, is to come up with some ideas and take the work that we talked about earlier, that Sandy Fraser's talked about a long-term integrated planning process. I think that there's various aspects under development within the department that I'm aware of already on a recovery rebuilding program, but that really is more focused on harvest management again, and it doesn't get to these other pieces around habitat and ecosystem. Also, there's documents that can provide us guidance that have been used in SARA around development of recovery plans, and there's action plans that could help provide some guidance. Because I really do see, the long-term plan sets the goals and the objectives, and the IFMPs are the implementation and operational arm of that, if you will.
All right, thank you for that explanation. And then the last bullet is consultation with First Nations and stakeholders on a proposed longer-term planning process. So under the heading stakeholders, I would assume that we're talking commercial fishing interests, and we're talking sports fishing interests, and we're talking also about Ango community. Is that right?
Those would be three key ones there. I don't know that I would limit it to that. For example, on the West Coast in the Barclay project, there's others in local governments that are very much interested in the regional scale as well. And so what sort of role might they play? And I don't have a particular answer for you, but they've written me a number of letters about how they might see fitting into this as well. There's pretty clear that they have roles on habitat and water use, as we've talked about as well. So there are, and where's the province fit into this as well? So there's those pieces. I wouldn't really particularly call the province a stakeholder per se, but they need to be as part of this as well.
Could this now be marked as the next exhibit in these proceedings, please?
Exhibit 971.
last few minutes I have remaining, I want to talk to the panel about Strategy 5, because lost in the shuffle is Strategy 5. Strategy 4, as I understand it, deals with long-term planning, and Strategy 5 is the annual workout of that long-term plan. And so I suppose to some extent it doesn't make sense to talk about Strategy 5 until you have Strategy 4 in place. Do I have that right, Mr. Young?
I'd say partly. I do think that the strategies are somewhat sequential. So to really do strategy 4 well, we have to have the outputs from strategies 1 to 3, and to do 5, consistently in a way that allows us to evaluate strategies 1 through 4, you're going to have those pieces there. However, I would suggest that having a kind of an annual plan that's reported out on to the public and other stakeholders that we can then look at and evaluate would have been useful even prior to the completion of those strategies.
Mr. Morley, do you have any comments about Strategy 5?
Nothing to add at this point, no, thank you.
All right. And Mr. Saunders or Mr. Ryle, do you want to talk about Strategy 5 at all? It seems to be getting lost in the shuffle of talking primarily about Strategy 4.
Well, I agree that there is a linear situation here in terms of the implementation, that just as I would agree with Mr. Young that it's difficult to move forward. So this is really the annual implementation and continual assessment of how well you're doing, how your annual objective or management actions and other actions that you might be taking are moving forward in the context of the larger plan. So, but there are elements of around, as we finish Strategy 1, the starting to assess the actual status of those conservation units, et cetera. So there are elements that, in the absence of the plan, that you'll see start getting invoked as we've completed parts of strategies 1 to 3.
Mr. Ryle, do you want to add anything?
Just to support the comments that Mark made, I think under Action Step 5.2, plan and conduct annual fisheries, that there's work underway in there, but in particular.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Leatham. Mr. Commissioner, the next on the list is Mr. Rosenblum for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Don Rosenblum, appearing on behalf of Area D, Gillnet, Area B, Sainer. Gentlemen, I have about 2 hours of cross-examination for you, but as I've been afforded only 15 minutes, I'm compressing things as much as possible. And to that end, Mr. Saunders, to speed things up, if you simply agree with everything that I put to you, we'll get through the 15 minutes very easily.
Understood.
Thank you. I appreciate you'll cooperate in that end. In fact, I want to start with Mr. Morley for a moment, and I would ask Mr. Lund to put before us yesterday's transcript at page 84. And Mr. Morley, at that, during the inquiry yesterday, you provided us with what I will describe as a very sobering and depressing prognosis for the implementation of WSP, and we all recall your words of yesterday in terms of speaking of what I will describe as the unrealistic schematic as is currently the modus operandi as chosen by DFO for future implementation. You recall giving that evidence yesterday.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, I do.
Yes, and regrettably the transcript at page 84 has your remarks as attributable to Mr. Young as opposed to yourself. And you would agree with me that indeed the words as set out there at page 84, line 11, are indeed your remarks and not that of Mr. Young.
I'm sure Mr. Young wishes he had said them, but they were mine, yes.
Yes, and can I have that confirmed by you, Mr. Young?
I can't agree with that.
I want you to explore a little bit further those remarks. Quite frankly, from certainly my perspective, your remarks were very significant and should be obviously part of the consideration and deliberations of this commission at the end of the day. You spoke in part at page 84 and on to page 85 and 86 about the concerns you had with the future direction as as planned by DFO. And you spoke about your experience with the Skeena Watershed Initiative, and you in fact said at page 84 that that was about to fall apart. Some of us certainly know nothing about what would be the foundation upon which you believe the whole thing is falling apart. Can you explain to us how that initiative has relevance to where DFO is heading in respect to WSP implementation? What are the lessons, and why did you say what you said yesterday?
Mr. Commissioner, I think to elaborate on some of the issues I raised yesterday, and I guess go back to the background, and I think why DFO has adopted this consultative approach to management that is very broad and tries to be all-encompassing and tries to be inclusive. And and we have heard from several of the DFO witnesses that, and I think it actually goes back to Mr. Sprout, the RDG, and I've had many conversations with him over the years. We both started in the department at almost a similar time and grew up through the department together. And you know, the department has a very difficult job in trying to satisfy a huge number of competing interests. And in the past, they had various stakeholder groups that they would meet with independently, and one group would complain with what the department is doing and saying that you're bending over backwards to satisfy the interests of the commercial sector when they're meeting the recreational sector or the First Nations or whatever. And I think the department kind of felt that they were being the ham and the sandwich, and that they were defending sort of another group. And so I think Mr. Sprout's idea at the time was, if we can get everyone into the same room, then at least they can start to talk to each other and understand each other's point of view, and we won't be there. In between them, they'll understand how difficult our job is, and they may even actually agree on things, and that we can reduce the areas where we have to get involved. Unfortunately, although I sympathize with that point of view, what we have developed now is a system where in these multi-stakeholder processes that the department has decided, and we've heard earlier testimony by Mr. Ryle and Mr. Saunders this morning, that the goal here is to bring people together to make decisions on trade-offs, that we want to sit down and agree on objectives. And I guess my problem with that approach and how it relates to what's happened to Skeena Watershed and the wild salmon policy is that, in fact, various stakeholder groups, there's many stakeholder groups as you have that many more objectives. And in fact, the objectives that groups have are sometimes the same and sometimes similar, but many times are in great conflict. And that if we sit down with the idea that we're going to agree on all the objectives and that we are going to somehow sit down through a process after this planning process and agree on a plan that has trade-offs when some people's objectives cannot be met because they're irreconcilable with other ones, that is problematic. And the other part of the process we've seen in the Skeena, and part of the reason it breaks down, is that the department has also developed these processes with outside facilitation involved. And with, again, part of the reason being that they, to a certain extent, want to be seen as participants, but not leaders of the process. And the result of that, from an efficiency point of view, is such that facilitators in these processes are people who have no background or knowledge in the subject area. They don't know, in many cases, do not know the players, and it takes a long time to get them up to speed. In the Skeena process, we've been through 2 separate sets of facilitators who are very skilled in their fields, but frankly, given the groups that we have around the table here, and there's very few of them, we all know each other. We've dealt with each other for years. We, I think, have a respect for each other's positions, and frankly, I'd much rather see DFO chairing meetings and taking responsibility for implementing actions rather than simply being a participant at the table. And so that's what we have seen, again, is that when you try to get people involved at every step of this process, from defining conservation units to assessing where they should be, as well as a lot of this habitat issue, sort of the strategy 3 issues, that you have a mix of technical and policy people who don't have the knowledge or skills to deal with some of those things, and when they're all trying to agree on objectives from day one, you end up running around in circles. And it goes back again to the idea that somehow we're developing a governance structure that will enable all of these participants to agree on a plan that involves trade-offs. And I guess from my point of view, the responsibility here is with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans constitutionally to be the manager, to manage fisheries and protect fisheries habitat that are required, and that they have to get on with the job and do it, and develop technical teams that will put forward all of the elements of the 5-step process in Appendix 2, seek input from groups where they have information to contribute to some of those elements, but really develop the options moving forward for the plan, do an evaluation of those options, of the consequences, and then seek input from the stakeholders as to whether they characterized those things properly at that point.
So you want the front-end loading to this process to be based upon technical committees within DFO doing that grunt work, as you used the term yesterday, before it's put before stakeholders. Is this correct?
Yes, and where there are technical people in First Nations communities who are doing a lot of these programs and developing the data, where there are outside technical people, I don't have an issue with them being involved in developing the background information, and they should be involved in that.
And you representing a stakeholder interest, it would seem at first blush that your testimony may be counterintuitive to your interest in saying what you've said to the Commission. Can you inform the Commission whether your viewpoint, as testified yesterday and today, is generally supported by my clients, Area B and Area D?
I believe your clients, Area B and Area D, are struggling with going to the number of meetings that exist already, that they're some of the few participants in these proceedings who are there paying entirely their own way, and may in many cases being missing out on income generation opportunities to participate in these processes. Most of the other groups involved are either paid a salary by their employer or supported by some funding from outside grant agencies like Packard or the Moore Foundation. And I think your members would fully support the view that we need to make this more efficient and process, because there are only so many people to go around, and we can't support that many processes. And we also believe that ultimately we will provide our advice, but the decision will have to be made by the Government of Canada, not by these groups.
Thank you. In your early testimony before this Commission last year, Mr. Morley, you spoke of the capacity or lack of capacity by DFO in-house to do socioeconomic work. You recall that testimony?
Yes, Mr. Commissioner.
And you still stand by that testimony?
I certainly do. I think that, in fact, and this I'll broaden it a little bit, is that I was, as I mentioned in my background when I first sat here, is that one of my roles in the department was the Director of Planning for the Salmonid Enhancement Program, and we had a multidisciplinary team of biologists, scientists, economists, and sociologists, and engineers who were involved in developing a comprehensive plan for the Salmonid Enhancement Program, and evaluating it against some of the indicators that are laid out in the wild salmon policy. And that was done with a technical team with in-house expertise, and was then exposed to advisory processes and consultations with stakeholders and First Nations groups to come up with the final plan. I think it was a an example of a planning process that could provide a lot of instruction to wild salmon policy. In terms of in-house economic expertise, I think one of the other things is that when you go outside and hire consultants to do the work, you may get a piece of work done, and it's going to be expensive, number one, more expensive than it would be to do internally. Secondly, you don't develop any of the human resources capability within your organization to understand those issues and wend them further into the upper management when the junior people doing that work get to more senior positions. So they actually have a broader understanding of the kinds of implications of fisheries and habitat management
Yes.
has in the economy.
Thank you. Time is so short, but Mr. Saunders or Mr. Raya, do either of you have comment as to the limited capacity currently of DFO in terms of socioeconomic in-house capacity? Do you agree with them generally?
I'll say that, and I'm not, I can't speak definitively on our capacity, but in my time, I understand in the last 5 years that the capacity within the department, in the policy branch, we've significantly increased our economics capacity. Whether it's enough to satisfy the needs of a process going forward, that remains to be seen. I don't believe we have the social, the capacity on the social side.
Thank you. Do you have anything further to say, Mr. Raya? Raya?
No, I would agree with what
Thank
Mark's
you.
remarks.
Speak or focus on habitat status reports for a moment. And I believe the evidence is that at this moment in time, the only habitat status reports that have been completed relate to 3 watersheds, Somas, Bedwell, and San Juan. Is that correct?
I don't know whether that's accurate or not.
Well, I take it actually from a document before you. Do you believe there are any other habitat status reports that have been completed in terms of the province of BC, the Pacific region?
I don't work in that area, so I can't
I see.
answer.
Mr. Saunders, do you know?
I don't have a final word on that.
All right. I had an exchange with Mr. Schubert, a witness in a previous panel, because there certainly is evidence before this tribunal, this commission, that there's never been a habitat status report conducted in respect to Caldas Lake. Mr. Schubert could not answer for us why that was the situation. Do either of you from DFO have any contribution to make to explain why Caldas Lake, of all watersheds, has never had a habitat status report done?
I don't know that I have the definitive answer on that, but my understanding is that the habitat status report was a convention that we developed as we were exploring how to move forward in the implementation of WSP and in particular Strategy 2. So many of the ones that have been conducted have been in support of pilots. So, and we, in working with the province and others, did do some extensive work in the Thompson on a number of indicators and approaches. So it's largely, it hasn't been an operational implementation, it's been more of a pilot implementation in terms of exploring how well those templates work.
Thank you. Also, I note that in some of the documents provided to us, in fact, in Exhibit 956, Mr. Lund, if you can put that up briefly, page 1, record of meeting, under mid-page strategy 1, this, in fact, I think is a presentation of you, Mr. Saunders, back in just a week or two ago, March 29th. The first bullet under Strategy 1, difficult to assess budget for WSP for upcoming years because of uncertainties regarding strategic review and departmental cuts, which are likely to affect core business. I assume you were speaking of upcoming years, including what's now the current fiscal year, April 1, 2011 to 2012. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I'm a little shocked that, 2 weeks before approximately, 3 days before the upcoming fiscal year, you were unaware of the budgetary situation for WSP. Are you now currently aware of what has been allocated to you for WSP for what is in fact the current year?
We're awaiting the federal budget that will come down shortly for final clarification on what our budgets will be for this current fiscal year.
So as you leave this panel, the Commission is unaware as to what will be the fiscal restraints to DFO in respect to WSP implementation for this current year, let alone future current years.
That's correct.
And once the federal budget has been, I have hopefully 30 seconds. Once the federal budget has been approved, you hopefully will know within a month or so what would be the restraints to DFO?
That's correct.
Thank you. I have one last thing, which is Exhibit 962, back to watershed for 3 seconds. I put to you, Mr. Ryle, about the 3 watersheds where habitat status reports have been completed. If Mr. Lund would go to page 5 of that document, headed towards improved understanding of CU's habitat and ecosystems under Strategy 2. Can we rely in this commission on the second bullet, completed habitat status reports for 3 watersheds, Somas, Bedwell, and San Juan? Is that accurate? Am I reading it correctly? That in terms of WSP, those are the only 3 watersheds that have had habitat status reports?
I can't answer your question whether that's the complete list or not.
You can't. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenblum, and I thank everybody for their working through these things as efficiently as possible. Mr. Harvey.
So it's Chris Harvey for Area G and UFAWU. Gentlemen, I'm going to start by asking Mr. Ryle some questions about Exhibit 755, which are his written answers previously submitted in writing. Mr. Ryle, you recognize these as your written responses to questions submitted in writing?
Yes, I do.
If I could go to question 9, please. You were asked there, was the Quesnel Lake component of the 2009 run the predominant contributor to the 2009 decline in Fraser River sockeye? You say you weren't part of the 2009 management. Question best addressed by those directly involved.
Mr. Commissioner, I wonder if Mr. Harvey could explain briefly how this relates to the implementation of Strategy 4 on WSP, please.
It all relates in that this relates to the setting of upper benchmarks. Most of my cross-examination will be directed to upper benchmarks. Can I ask some other panel members just to so we can satisfy ourselves that the Quesnel run was meant to be the dominant and the major run in 2009. Perhaps Mr. Morley knows that.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, that's correct.
Yes. Question 10. Question 10. What was the spawning escapement target for Quesnel in 2001 and 2005? And there's an answer that explains that the escapement targets are at the level of management groups, not at individual stocks. And then you say at the bottom of the page, applying that escapement and TAM rule to the final run size for summer runs produces an escapement target of 3,929,000. 2001 and over 4 million 2005. In that answer, you made reference to you determined the escapement target by referring to the final run size. Is it correct to infer from that the escapement target cannot be identified until the final run size is known?
No. In 2001 and 2005, we'd have to go back to what the escapement plan was in those years and bring that up to see what what the rules were in place in 2001 and 5, and they would be included in the Fraser River annual reports that are referenced.
All right. But they show, do they not, that the escapement target is variable. It changes in season according to changes in the run size.
They do change depending on run sizes. Went through in my previous testimony today, yes.
Yes, all right. So we can take it from that then that the escapement targets are not based on the carrying capacity of the freshwater ecosystem. That is to say, they're not biologically determined escapement targets.
I would disagree with that totally. They're biologically determined, and as I talked about earlier, you can make some choices on what sort of escapement strategy one wants to take a look at. You can have a choice around a fixed escapement number. You can have a choice around ones that are harvest rate based.
Yes.
And the whole point of going through the Frizzy program was to explore those alternatives and the impacts. And so the scientific reviews of the outcome was that it would be best to use a harvest rate approach. And that's what's in place currently.
Yes, and that results in an escapement target that varies according to run size.
To some degree.
To
As I
some
explained
degree.
earlier, that there's a point where there's a fixed amount of fish that are put on the ground over quite a wide range of run sizes, and at an upper point there is a fixed harvest rate, and the amount of fish that are on the spawning grounds does increase.
Yes, the green line in the graph you show always goes up at an angle.
That's correct.
Yes. But yet the carrying capacity of the freshwater system doesn't increase in season, does it?
Well, does it change the carrying capacity?
No. My question was the carrying capacity itself can be predetermined and it stays the same throughout the season.
Well, you're stating that there's an absolute understanding of what the carrying capacity is, and I don't think that is well known.
All right.
And so the whole point of a fixed escapement strategy is the reason that we're not having that in place, and that's why there was a lot of scientific work undertaken on this particular aspect. And I think what you're looking for is that we know exactly the carrying capacity, whether it be the spawning grounds or the lakes that where sockeye rear, and that is not really what the current understanding is.
Well, whether we know it or not, it wouldn't change in season, would it?
Well, I don't know what the focus is on the in-season, but carrying capacity can change, I would say, substantially, depending on what is available for spawning and what the condition of the gravel is,
All right.
what the status of the lake is as far as food and groceries in the lake for the fish to rear.
Yes. All right.
So it's not a static answer that you're asking me. Their habitat changes over time, and as the habitat, for example, in the Fraser watershed has changed from what it was a decade ago and 50 years ago, and so there's not a one particular fixed answer to this. That's one of our challenges.
You wouldn't expect it to change between June and October, would you?
I don't know.
All right.
It could change. I've seen it change.
Yes. The is escapement target that is used in this question and answer, is that the same term as upper benchmark in the WSP?
Which part are you referring to?
Well, this is question 10. I asked you about the spawning escapement target, and you gave me, then you explained how they are set, and you explained what they were. Is that the what is the relationship between that and upper benchmark?
Well, in this particular years that we're looking at in question 10, it would be best to go back to the actual escapement strategy. This is trying to address the question that you asked, what the escapement target specifically was 2001 and 2005, and the way I provided the answer back was applying that escapement strategy to what the final run size was.
All right.
And I guess just to be, to expand on my answer about things changing in season as far as capacity, I think that's probably more the exception, given, you talked about from June, July, but the only reason I said it can change, I've seen where there's flood events that have made some changes They're
Yes.
probably not the typical pattern, but to me, things are not static. It's a biological system, and they do change.
Question 11 is what was the actual spawning escapement for Quesnel sockeye in 2001, 2005? And you give it there 3.5 million odd, 1.4. And then question 14 is the same question for 2002 and 2006. The actual escapement, 2002, 3,062,000. These are the results of the application of the management system in place at that time. Is that correct?
It would be the outcome of the management actions and the application of the escapement strategy. It also would be the outcome of if there were fish that died en route in any one of those particular years as well.
Yes.
That has also been prevalent, but not really with the Quesnel.
And finally, before we take the lunch break, question 26. Question 26. The question is, Dr. Riddle said on December 1st that he expected the upper escapement benchmarks to change as a result of the publication of Exhibit 184. And then the question is, have they changed, and if so, how? And you give a long answer, but what it comes to is this, isn't it, that the benchmarks are under constant review, but they have not changed as a result of Exhibit 184. Is that a fair summary?
That is, they have not changed. I would agree.
Yes, all right. I think it's exactly 12:30, so maybe I'll continue after lunch.
Hearing will now adjourn until 2 p.m.